Officer David Chen stood in the dimly lit courthouse hallway, his polished badge reflecting the fluorescent lights above. After 15 years on the force and 12 years of what he thought was a happy marriage, he never imagined he'd be here, about to face his wife in divorce proceedings. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, the same one she had given him on their 10th anniversary. The morning had started like any other. He'd woken up at 5 a.m., made coffee in their modest suburban home, and prepared for another day of protecting and serving his community. But today wasn't just another day, it was the day his wife had chosen to end their marriage, and he still didn't understand why. As he waited outside the courtroom, memories flooded his mind. The day they met at the local coffee shop where she worked while pursuing her teaching degree. Their first date at the city park, where they talked until the stars came out. The small, intimate wedding in her parents' backyard, where they promised to love each other forever. Now, those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life. His partner on the force, Officer Rodriguez, had tried to warn him. There had been signs, late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room, unexplained absences, and a growing emotional distance that seemed to expand like a chasm between them. But David, ever the optimist, had attributed it all to the stress of their careers and the long hours they both worked. Linda, his wife, had been acting strange for months. She'd started coming home later from her teaching job, citing endless parent-teacher conferences and curriculum planning meetings. She changed her passwords, started going to the gym more frequently, and seemed to guard her phone like it contained state secrets. Still, David never suspected what was really happening. The truth began to unravel 3 weeks ago. It started with a simple receipt he found while doing laundry, a dinner for two at an upscale restaurant on the other side of town, dated on a night when Linda had claimed to be working late. The discovery led him down a path he never wanted to travel, each new piece of evidence feeling like a knife in his heart. As he sat on the cold wooden bench outside the courtroom, David's mind wandered to the evening he confronted her. She had been surprisingly calm, almost relieved, as she announced her intention to file for divorce. No explanations, no apologies, just a clinical declaration that their marriage was over. But David knew there had to be more to the story. His years as a police officer had taught him that there were always layers to every truth, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. His fellow officers had rallied around him, offering support and helping him gather information. What they discovered would change everything, but for now, David sat alone with his thoughts, watching the minute hand tick closer to the hearing time. The courthouse began to fill with the usual morning crowd, lawyers in pressed suits, clients with worried faces, court officers maintaining order in the chaos. Through the growing crowd, he caught glimpses of Linda's family arriving, their faces a mixture of sympathy and accusation. They had always been close, sharing Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, but now they passed by without acknowledging him. Her sister, who had once joked about him being the brother she never had, couldn't even meet his eyes. The weight of his service weapon at his hip provided an odd comfort, a reminder of his duty and the structure it brought to his life. Even as his personal life crumbled, he had never let it affect his work. Each day, he put on his uniform, pinned on his badge, and served his community with the same dedication he always had. His precinct had become a sanctuary, the one place where everything still made sense. A young clerk appeared at the courtroom door, calling out names and directing people to their designated places. David's heart raced as he heard his name, knowing that in moments he would face not only his wife but also the truth that had brought them to this point. As he stood, straightening his jacket and squaring his shoulders, he reminded himself that he had faced worse situations in the line of duty. But somehow, this felt different, more personal, more devastating. The truth he carried with him would shock everyone in that courtroom, including Linda. It wasn't just about their marriage anymore, it was about justice, truth, and the kind of integrity he'd sworn to uphold when he first pinned on his badge. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, David took a deep breath, knowing that what was about to unfold would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone involved. The courtroom fell silent as he entered, all eyes turning to watch the police officer who was about to stand against his wife in what everyone expected to be a routine divorce hearing. But there was nothing routine about what was about to happen, and as David caught sight of Linda sitting with her attorney, he steeled himself for the moment when everything would come to light. Inside the courtroom, David's eyes adjusted to the harsh fluorescent lighting as he made his way to his seat. His attorney, Mrs. Thompson, a veteran of family law with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, gave him a reassuring nod. She was one of the few people who knew the full story, and her calm demeanor helped steady his nerves. Linda sat across the aisle, perfectly composed in a navy blue suit, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked exactly like the respected high school teacher she was, someone who had dedicated her life to shaping young minds. But David now knew that appearance could be deceiving. Their eyes met briefly, and he noticed something flicker across her face. Was it guilt, fear, or something else entirely? The judge, a stern-looking woman with decades of experience etched into her face, called the court to order. As the preliminary proceedings began, David's mind drifted to the investigation that had led him to this moment. It had started with that restaurant receipt, but what he and his fellow officers uncovered went far beyond a simple affair. 3 months ago, the department had launched an investigation into a sophisticated money laundering operation running through several local businesses. David had been kept off the case due to his connection to the school district, but he hadn't known why at the time. Now, everything was starting to make horrible sense. Linda's attorney began presenting their case, painting a picture of a marriage that had gradually fallen apart due to David's long hours and dedication to his job. He described how Linda had felt neglected, how the couple had grown apart, and how his client simply wanted a fresh start. It was a compelling story, one that David might have believed himself if he didn't know the truth. As he listened, David's hand brushed against the manila envelope in his briefcase. Inside were documents that would change everything: bank statements, surveillance photos, and transaction records that told a very different story. His heart ached as he thought about Linda's students, her colleagues, and their families. They all believed in her, just as he had. The school where Linda taught was more than just her workplace, it had been the center of their community. They'd attended countless school functions together, cheered at football games, and celebrated student achievements. David had even helped coach the school's junior police academy program. Now, he understood why she had been so insistent that he stepped down from that role last year. Mrs. Thompson stood up to present their response to the divorce petition. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and confident, "before we proceed with the division of assets, there are some matters that need to be brought to the court's attention." Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and her attorney leaned over to whisper something in her ear. The evidence they were about to present would reveal that Linda's recent behavior wasn't about a failing marriage or a midlife crisis. The late nights weren't spent with a lover, but with members of a criminal organization that had infiltrated the school system. The gym visits were actually meetings with people who used the school's fundraising activities to clean dirty money. David watched as Mrs. Thompson methodically laid out the first pieces of evidence. Bank statements showed irregular deposits into accounts connected to school programs that Linda supervised. Surveillance photos captured meetings with known criminals under the guise of parent-teacher conferences. Phone records revealed patterns of communication with individuals under investigation by the department. Linda's face grew paler with each new piece of evidence. Her attorney appeared increasingly agitated, frantically scribbling notes and whispering to his client. The judge's expression remained neutral, but her eyes narrowed as she examined the documents being presented. The courtroom atmosphere grew tenser as Mrs. Thompson approached the crucial revelation. David knew what was coming next, the evidence that would explain why Linda had really filed for divorce. It wasn't about ending a loveless marriage, it was about cutting ties before her activities came to light. She hadn't counted on David's colleagues already being on her trail. Just as Mrs. Thompson was about to reveal the most damning evidence, the courtroom doors burst open. A man in a dark suit strode in, followed by two uniformed officers. David recognized him immediately, Agent Clark from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The agent's presence confirmed what David had suspected: this case was bigger than anyone in the room had imagined. The judge called for order as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Linda's attorney jumped to his feet, demanding to know the meaning of this interruption. But David could see in Linda's eyes that she knew exactly what was happening. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained for so long was finally crumbling. Agent Clark approached the bench, presenting the judge with a document that would change the course of the proceedings. As the judge reviewed the papers, David caught a glimpse of Linda's family in the gallery. The shock and confusion on their faces mirrored what he had felt when he first discovered the truth. They had all been deceived, all been part of an elaborate performance that was now reaching its final act. The weight of the moment pressed down on David as he realized that everything was about to change. The divorce proceedings had become secondary to something much larger and more serious. As he watched Linda's composed exterior finally begin to crack, he felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for the years of deception and the impact this would have on their community. The judge's chambers had become a temporary command center as Agent Clark laid out the full scope of the investigation. David sat quietly, his police training helping him maintain his composure as the FBI agent revealed how his wife had become entangled in a massive criminal enterprise that spread far beyond their small community. The story that emerged was both shocking and heartbreaking. It had begun 3 years ago when Linda was appointed as the school's fundraising coordinator. Her success in raising money for new computers and sports equipment had caught the attention of people who saw an opportunity. These weren't just local criminals, they were part of an international organization that specialized in using legitimate institutions to clean their illegal profits. "Officer Chen," Agent Clark said, his voice gentle but firm, "your wife's position at the school made her an ideal target." The organization approached her through a parent who claimed to represent a charitable foundation. They started small, donations that seemed completely legitimate. By the time she realized what was really happening, she was already compromised. David's mind raced back to the subtle changes he'd noticed in Linda over the past few years. The nervous energy when discussing school finances, the late-night phone calls she claimed were from parents, the increasing isolation from their friends. All the signs had been there, but he'd interpreted them through the lens of marital problems rather than criminal activity. Outside the judge's chambers, the courthouse had erupted into controlled chaos. News of the FBI's presence had spread quickly, and reporters were already gathering in the parking lot. Linda's attorney paced the hallway, making frantic phone calls, while her family huddled together, their faces masks of confusion and disbelief. Mrs. Thompson, David's attorney, was reviewing the FBI's documents with practiced efficiency. "The divorce filing was their idea, wasn't it?" she asked Agent Clark. A way to distance Linda from David before everything came to light? The agent nodded. "We believe so. The organization probably saw Officer Chen as a liability. A police officer husband would draw unwanted attention once we started making arrests. They likely pressured Linda to file for divorce to create a paper trail of separation." David thought about the night Linda had told him she wanted a divorce. The rehearsed quality of her words, the way she'd avoided looking directly at him, it all made sense now. She hadn't been leaving him for another man, she'd been trying to protect him, in her own misguided way. The judge returned to her chambers, her face grave. "This is no longer just a divorce proceeding," she announced. "Agent Clark, I understand you have federal agents ready to move on several locations?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have teams in position at the school, 3 local businesses, and several private residences. We're coordinating with local law enforcement to execute simultaneous raids." David's police radio crackled to life. His precinct was mobilizing to assist with the FBI operation. For a moment, he felt torn between his duty as an officer and his role in this unfolding personal drama. The judge seemed to sense his conflict. "Officer Chen, given your personal connection to this case, I suggest you remain here. Your colleagues can handle the operational aspects." In the main courtroom, Linda sat alone, her attorney having stepped out to consult with colleagues. David watched through the window as she stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. The composed facade she'd maintained earlier had crumbled, revealing the tremendous weight she'd been carrying. Agent Clark continued briefing them on the investigation. The organization had used the school's fundraising events to launder millions of dollars. Book fairs, bake sales, athletic tournaments, all had been corrupted to serve their purposes. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. The FBI had uncovered evidence that the organization was using the school's international exchange program to traffic more than just cash. "We've identified at least 15 students who were brought into the country under suspicious circumstances," Agent Clark explained. "The paperwork looks legitimate, but we believe these children are being used as unwitting couriers." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. He thought about the exchange students he'd met at school events, how proud Linda had been of the program's growth. Had she known about this aspect of the operation? The thought of children being exploited made his blood boil. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. A court officer entered, whispering something to the judge. She nodded grimly before addressing the room. "Linda is asking to speak with Agent Clark and Officer Chen. She says she's ready to tell everything she knows." The walk back to the courtroom felt like the longest of David's life. Each step brought him closer to confronting the full truth about the woman he'd loved for 12 years. As they approached, he could see that Linda had been crying, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered as they sat down. "I never meant for any of this to happen. When I realized what they were really doing with the exchange program, I tried to find a way out. But they made it clear what would happen if I talked." Agent Clark leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, we need to know everything. Every name, every transaction, every student who might be at risk. We have teams ready to move, but we need your help to ensure everyone's safety." Linda nodded, reaching into her bag with trembling hands. She withdrew a small notebook, its pages filled with her neat teacher's handwriting. "I've been keeping records," she said. "Names, dates, amounts. I knew someday I'd have to make this right." As Linda began to speak, David realized that the truth was far more complex than he'd imagined. His wife wasn't just a willing participant in a criminal enterprise, she was someone who had become trapped in a situation that had spiraled far beyond her control. The divorce filing hadn't been about abandoning their marriage, it had been her desperate attempt to protect him from what she knew was coming. The next few hours would change everything, for them, for their community, and for the innocent students caught in the middle of this sprawling criminal operation. As Linda's confession unfolded, David understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. The school parking lot was filled with FBI vehicles and police cars, their lights painting the brick walls in alternating red and blue. David watched from his unmarked car as agents led people out in handcuffs, the school principal, 2 administrative staff members, and several parents he'd known for years. Each arrest felt like another crack in the foundation of the community he'd sworn to protect. Linda's confession had set everything in motion. In the hours since she'd started talking, the true scope of the operation had become clear. The organization had chosen their school district because of its reputation for academic excellence and its robust international program. It had seemed like the perfect cover. Who would suspect a highly ranked public school of being at the center of an international money laundering scheme? David's phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow officers and concerned community members. News traveled fast in a small town, and the sight of federal agents at the school had sparked a wildfire of rumors and speculation. He thought about the hundreds of innocent students and teachers who would be affected by this, the trust that had been broken, the relationships that would never be the same. Inside the school, Agent Clark and his team were gathering evidence. Linda's notebook had provided them with exactly what they needed: dates, names, and detailed records of every transaction. She had documented everything, perhaps knowing that someday she would need to make things right. The agent had been surprised by the level of detail in her records. "Your wife did us a huge favor," Agent Clark had told David earlier. "She's been gathering evidence for months. Without her documentation, it would have taken us years to build a case this strong." The revelation had stirred complicated emotions in David. Pride in Linda's courage to finally come forward, anger at the people who had manipulated her, and a deep sadness for what their life had become. The divorce papers that had seemed so important this morning now felt insignificant compared to the bigger picture. As he sat in his car, David remembered the conversation he'd had with Linda after her initial confession. They had been given a few minutes alone, supervised by agents but away from the formal atmosphere of the courtroom. She had looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they made it clear that they had people watching you. They knew your patrol routes, your favorite coffee shop, everything. I thought filing for divorce would keep you safe." David had reached across the table then, taking her hand for the first time in months. It had felt like bridging an ocean. "You should have trusted me," he'd said softly. "We could have faced this together." Now, as the operation unfolded around him, David understood why she hadn't. The organization's reach was impressive. Already, arrests were being made across the city: business owners, financial advisors, even a city council member. People they had known and trusted for years were being revealed as part of this elaborate criminal network. The school's parking lot had become a command center for the joint FBI police operation. David watched as Detective Wong, his former partner, coordinated with federal agents. They had worked hundreds of cases together, but nothing like this. The detective caught his eye and walked over to his car. "You holding up okay?" Wong asked, leaning against the driver's side door. "This is heavy stuff, even for someone with your experience." David nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed. The late-night phone calls, the mysterious meetings, the way she would change the subject whenever I asked about school finances. I should have seen it." Wong shook his head. "Don't do that to yourself. These people were professionals. They knew exactly how to operate without raising suspicion. Even we didn't see it until the feds brought us in." Inside the school, agents were going through records in the main office. The organization had been clever, using the school's legitimate needs as cover for their activities. Every real fundraiser had its shadow counterpart. Every genuine international student's paperwork had been used to create false documentation for others. David's radio crackled with updates from various teams. They had found cash hidden in textbook shipments, fake documentation in seemingly innocent student files, and evidence of a sophisticated computer system used to track their illegal transactions. The organization had thought of everything, except for Linda's secret record keeping. As the afternoon wore on, parents began arriving at the school, having heard the news through various channels. They gathered at the police barrier, their faces showing confusion, anger, and fear. David recognized many of them from school events and community gatherings. These were people who had trusted their children's education to this institution, who had donated time and money to what they thought were legitimate causes. A young officer was assigned to handle the growing crowd, explaining that classes had been suspended and arrangements were being made to safely dismiss all students. The officer's voice was steady, but David could see the strain on his face. How do you tell parents that their children's school had been used as a front for criminal activities? Linda's family had arrived at the school as well, standing apart from the other parents. Her sister caught David's eye, and he could see the question in her face: how had none of them noticed? They had all been so proud of Linda's success with the school's fundraising efforts, never suspecting that something sinister lay beneath the surface. Agent Clark emerged from the school, carrying boxes of documents. He stopped at David's car, his expression grim but satisfied. "Your wife's cooperation has been invaluable," he said. "The evidence she preserved will help us dismantle similar operations in other districts. She may have started out as part of the problem, but she ended up being the key to solving it." The words brought little comfort to David. He knew that despite her cooperation, Linda would still face consequences for her role in the scheme. The organization's threats might have explained her actions, but they didn't excuse them. The coming months would be difficult for everyone involved. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the school grounds, David thought about the morning's divorce hearing. It felt like a lifetime ago. The truth that had emerged was far more complex and far-reaching than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. Now, as he watched federal agents carry out box after box of evidence, he wondered what other secrets would come to light in the days ahead. 1 week after the dramatic events at the school, David sat in his living room surrounded by newspapers. Every local paper had covered the story extensively, their headlines growing more sensational with each passing day. The most recent one read, "International Crime Ring Used Local School as Front, Trusted Teacher Breaks Silence." The house felt different now. Linda's belongings were still there, but she wouldn't be coming back for them anytime soon. She was under protective custody in a safe house, working with federal prosecutors to build cases against the organization's higher-ups. The divorce proceedings had been temporarily suspended. There were far more pressing legal matters to address. David's phone lit up with a text from Agent Clark, "Press conference in 2 hours. You might want to watch this one." The FBI had been strategic about releasing information, careful not to compromise their ongoing operations in other cities. Today, they would finally reveal the full scope of what they'd uncovered. He turned on the TV, more out of habit than interest. The local news was showing footage of the school, where workers were removing the sign for the International Student Program. The sight made his heart heavy. That program had helped so many legitimate students over the years, giving them opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Now, it was permanently tainted. His doorbell rang, surprising him. Opening the door, he found Mrs. Wu, the mother of one of Linda's former students. She stood there awkwardly, holding a covered dish. "Officer Chen," she said softly, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted you to know that not everyone believes what they're saying about Linda in the media. My daughter was in her class last year, and the care she showed for her students was real. Whatever else happened, that wasn't fake." David accepted the dish, touched by the gesture. As Mrs. Wu left, he noticed other neighbors watching from their windows. Some quickly drew their curtains when they saw him looking, while others offered small waves of support. The community was divided, struggling to reconcile the Linda they knew with the revelations of the past week. At the police station, things had changed too. David had been placed on administrative leave, standard procedure given his connection to the case. His colleagues were supportive, but there was an undeniable awkwardness in their interactions. How do you talk to someone whose wife is now a key witness in a federal investigation? Detective Wong dropped by his desk to collect some files. "The feds just arrested another group in Boston," he said. "Same setup, using a school's international program as cover. Your wife's information helped them connect the dots. She might have helped save a lot of kids from being exploited." The investigation had revealed that the organization had been using unsuspecting international students as unwitting couriers, hiding cash and documents in their belongings during legitimate school trips. The students had been carefully chosen, always from wealthy families, always with pristine records. No one would think to question them too closely. David's living room table was covered with letters from former students and their parents. Some expressed shock and betrayal, others offered support and understanding. One letter particularly stood out. It was from a former exchange student who had lived with them for a semester. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Chen," it read, "I don't know if you'll receive this, but I needed to write. When I heard the news, I went through all my memories of my time with you, wondering if I had been used without knowing it. But what I remember most is how Linda helped me when I was homesick, how she sat up with me late at night helping me with my English essays. That kindness was real, regardless of what else was happening. The TV news switched to live coverage outside the federal courthouse. Reporters were gathering for the FBI's press conference. David recognized some of the faces in the crowd, parents from the school, local business owners, even some of his fellow officers. Everyone wanted answers. His phone rang. It was Linda's sister. They hadn't spoken since the day at the courthouse. "David," she said, her voice trembling, "I just wanted you to know that Mom and Dad are watching Linda's bank account records. All those expensive gifts she bought last year, she was sending them to children's hospitals. Even when she was involved in all this, she was trying to do some good." The revelation didn't surprise him. That was the Linda he had known and loved, someone who always tried to find ways to help others, even when she was in over her head. It made her current situation even more tragic. Agent Clark appeared on the TV screen, approaching a podium crowded with microphones. Behind him stood several other agents and prosecutors. The press conference was about to begin. "Good afternoon," Clark started. "Today we are announcing the results of Operation Clean Slate, a multi-year investigation into an international criminal organization that has been using educational institutions as fronts for money laundering and other illegal activities." David watched as the agent outlined the scope of the operation: dozens of schools across multiple states, millions of dollars laundered through fake fundraisers, and an elaborate network of fake exchange programs. But what caught his attention was the way Clark spoke about Linda. A key breakthrough in this investigation came from a source within one of the targeted schools, Clark said. "This individual, at great personal risk, documented the organization's activities over several months, providing us with crucial evidence that will help dismantle similar operations across the country." The camera panned across the crowd, showing the mixed reactions. Some people nodded in approval, while others shook their heads in disgust. David understood both responses. Linda's actions had helped expose a massive criminal enterprise, but she had also betrayed the trust of her community. As the press conference continued, David's thoughts drifted to the future. The divorce papers still sat on his desk, unsigned. Linda's confession had changed everything, but it hadn't erased the past 12 years of marriage. He thought about what Mrs. Wu had said, that the care Linda showed for her students was real. Perhaps the same was true of their marriage. The sound of more cars arriving outside drew his attention. News vans were parking along his street, reporters hoping to get a comment from the police officer whose wife had helped expose an international criminal organization. David drew his curtains, knowing that this was just the beginning. The story was far from over, and its ripple effects would be felt for years to come. 3 months after the initial arrests, David stood in the back of a packed federal courtroom. The first major trial connected to the school scandal was about to begin, and Linda would be testifying as a key witness. The prosecution had worked out a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation. She would serve a reduced sentence and provide evidence against the organization's leadership. The courtroom was filled with familiar faces. School board members, teachers, parents, and local reporters all sat in tense anticipation. At the defense table sat the organization's regional director, a man who had attended numerous school functions over the years, always introducing himself as a representative of an educational consulting firm. David watched as Linda was escorted in by federal marshals. She looked different now, thinner, paler, but somehow more determined. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw a flash of the woman he'd fallen in love with years ago. The woman who, despite her mistakes, had finally chosen to do the right thing. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Patel began her opening statement, laying out the prosecution's case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about trust and betrayal. It's about criminals who saw an opportunity in one of our most sacred institutions, our schools, and exploited it for their own gain. But it's also about courage. The courage of one person who decided to stand up and expose the truth, no matter the personal cost. As the prosecutor spoke, David's mind wandered to the changes the past 3 months had brought. The school district had undergone a complete overhaul. A new administration was in place, implementing strict financial oversight measures. The international program was being rebuilt from the ground up, with federal authorities closely monitoring every aspect. His own life had changed dramatically too. After weeks on administrative leave, he'd been cleared to return to duty. His superiors had even offered him a promotion to detective, citing his handling of the difficult situation. He'd declined, preferring to remain in patrol where he could maintain direct contact with the community that needed healing. Linda's notebook had proved invaluable to the prosecution. Page after page detailed how the organization had slowly infiltrated the school system. It started with seemingly legitimate donations and escalated to using school events as cover for money laundering. The notebook revealed how they pressured people into cooperation, using a combination of bribes and threats. During a court recess, Agent Clark approached David in the hallway. "The information your wife provided has led to arrests in 6 other states," he said. "We've identified over 200 students who were unknowingly used as couriers. Some of these kids could have faced serious charges if they'd been caught. She probably saved their futures." The agent's words brought mixed emotions. David was proud of Linda's eventual courage but couldn't forget the years of deception. Their marriage had become another casualty of this case, though not in the way either of them had expected when they'd first entered the courthouse months ago. Back in the courtroom, Linda took the stand. Her testimony was clear and detailed, her voice growing stronger as she explained how the organization had operated. She described how they targeted schools with strong reputations and financial needs, how they groomed administrators and teachers, and how they ensured silence through a sophisticated system of rewards and threats. "They knew everything about everyone," she testified. "They had files on teachers, administrators, even their families. When I realized what they were doing with the exchange students, I wanted to stop. But they showed me pictures of my husband on patrol, pictures of our nieces and nephews at their schools." The message was clear. During cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to paint Linda as an unwilling participant who only turned state's evidence to save herself. But she remained composed, acknowledging her own guilt while firmly establishing the systematic way the organization had compromised people within the school system. In the gallery, David noticed Linda's parents. They had stood by their daughter after learning the full story, understanding that she had been caught in something much bigger than herself. They had even helped the FBI by providing old emails and documents that supported her testimony. The trial was expected to last several weeks, but Linda's testimony was crucial in establishing the organization's methods and reach. During breaks, David overheard other witnesses discussing their own experiences. Teachers who had been pressured into silence, administrators who had been threatened, parents who had unknowingly participated in fraudulent fundraisers, each story added another piece to the puzzle. Late that afternoon, as the court session ended, David received an unexpected message from Mrs. Thompson, his divorce attorney. Linda had requested to withdraw the divorce petition. The message included a handwritten note: "I know I've lost the right to ask anything of you, but I hope someday you can understand why I did what I did. Whatever happens, know that my love for you was never part of the lie." Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements from anyone connected to the case. David slipped out a side entrance, needing time to process everything. He drove to the park where he and Linda had their first date, the place where they had once talked about their dreams for the future. The sun was setting as he sat on their old favorite bench. His phone buzzed with messages from fellow officers. They'd made more arrests based on Linda's testimony. The organization was crumbling, its carefully constructed facade falling apart as more people came forward with evidence. A light rain began to fall as David read Linda's note again. Their marriage had been built on love and trust, both of which had been severely tested. The question now was whether anything could be salvaged from the wreckage. Linda's request to withdraw the divorce petition suggested she hadn't given up hope, but the path forward was far from clear. As darkness settled over the park, David thought about something his father, also a police officer, had once told him: sometimes the hardest cases are the ones closest to home. He couldn't have known how prophetic those words would prove to be. The case had exposed a massive criminal enterprise, but it had also exposed the complexities of trust, love, and redemption. Tomorrow, Linda would return to the stand to continue her testimony. More secrets would come to light, more connections would be revealed, and more people would face consequences for their actions. But for now, David sat alone in the rain, holding a note from his wife and wondering about the true meaning of justice and forgiveness. 6 months after the trial began, David stood in front of the renovated school building on a crisp autumn morning. The old sign had been replaced, and students were finally returning to their classrooms. The scandal had shaken the community to its core, but slowly, painfully, healing had begun. The trial had concluded 2 weeks ago with guilty verdicts for the organization's leaders. Linda's testimony had been instrumental, leading to convictions not just in their case, but in similar cases across the country. The prosecution had called it one of the most significant victories against educational fraud in recent history. Today was Linda's sentencing hearing. Despite her cooperation, she would still face consequences for her role in the scheme. The prosecution had recommended a lighter sentence, 2 years in a minimum security facility, followed by 3 years of supervised release. It was far less than what others in the case had received, but it still meant time away from everything she knew. As David drove to the courthouse, he reflected on the changes the past 6 months had brought. The school district had implemented new oversight measures, with federal authorities helping to create a model program for preventing similar schemes. Other districts across the country were now studying their case, learning from their mistakes and strengthening their own security measures. The parking lot was less crowded than during the main trial. Most of the media attention had faded, though a few reporters still lingered, hoping to capture the final chapter of this story. David recognized some familiar faces: teachers who had supported Linda, parents who had come to understand the complexities of her situation, and fellow officers who had worked the case. Inside the courtroom, Linda sat with her attorney, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had lost weight during the trial, but her eyes were clear and focused. The fear that had haunted her for so long seemed to have been replaced by a quiet acceptance of what was to come. Judge Harrison, who had presided over the main trial, studied the sentencing documents carefully. She had heard testimony from character witnesses, former students whose lives Linda had positively impacted, colleagues who spoke of her dedication to teaching, and even some of the legitimate exchange students who had flourished under her guidance. "Mrs. Chen," the judge began, "this court has carefully considered your role in this criminal enterprise, as well as your subsequent actions to expose and help dismantle it. Your cooperation has been extraordinary, leading to numerous convictions and the recovery of millions in illegally laundered funds. However, we cannot ignore that you participated in these schemes for several years, betraying the trust placed in you as an educator." David watched as Linda stood to address the court. Her voice was steady as she spoke. "Your Honor, I know that saying, 'I'm sorry,' isn't enough. I betrayed my students, my community, and my husband. When I first realized what was happening, I told myself I was protecting people by staying quiet. But I was really just protecting myself. It wasn't until I saw how they were using innocent students that I found the courage to speak up. I accept whatever punishment the court deems appropriate." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Chen, your case presents this court with a unique challenge. How do we balance the serious nature of your crimes against the substantial assistance you've provided in bringing others to justice? How do we acknowledge both the harm you've caused and the good you've done in helping to prevent future victims?" As the judge spoke, David remembered the conversations he'd had with Linda during the trial. They had met several times, always under supervision, trying to understand each other's perspectives. She had finally told him everything, how the organization had first approached her, how they had gradually drawn her in, and how their threats had kept her silent. After careful consideration, Judge Harrison continued, "This court sentences you to 18 months in a minimum security facility, followed by 2 years of supervised release. Additionally, you will perform 1,000 hours of community service, focusing on educational program oversight and fraud prevention." The sentence was more lenient than expected. The judge went on to explain that Linda's extensive cooperation and the unusual circumstances of her case had warranted a downward departure from the guidelines. There were murmurs in the courtroom, some of approval, others of disagreement. As the proceedings concluded, Linda turned to look at David. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The divorce petition remained withdrawn, but they both knew their relationship would never be the same. It would take time to determine what, if anything, could be rebuilt from the ashes of their past. Outside the courthouse, David found himself surrounded by the people whose lives had been touched by this case. Mrs. Wu, who had brought him food during the difficult days of the trial, was there with her daughter. The girl had written a letter to the judge about how Mrs. Chen had helped her overcome her fear of mathematics. Agent Clark approached, offering his hand. "The Bureau is using this case as a training model," he said. "Your wife's documentation and testimony have helped us create new protocols for identifying similar schemes. Some good has come from all of this." As the crowd dispersed, David walked to his car alone. The morning's frost had melted, leaving everything looking clean and new. He thought about Linda's sentencing, about the months ahead, and about the uncertain future they faced. The organization she had helped expose was finished, its leaders facing decades in prison, but the ripple effects of their actions would continue to impact lives for years to come. Later that evening, David sat in their empty house, surrounded by the echoes of their shared life. Linda would begin serving her sentence in 2 weeks. She had asked to see him before then, to talk about what might come after. He hadn't given her an answer yet. His phone lit up with a text from Detective Wong. "Just got word, 3 more schools identified similar patterns thanks to the warning signs Linda documented. We stopped them before they could get started. Thought you should know." David looked at the divorce papers still sitting on his desk, now covered in a thin layer of dust. Next to them lay Linda's notebook, which had become a crucial piece of evidence in dismantling the criminal enterprise. Both represented different kinds of truth, one about the end of what was, the other about the beginning of something new. Tomorrow, he would return to patrol, continuing to serve the community that was slowly rebuilding its trust. Linda would soon begin her sentence, working to make amends for her actions. And somewhere in between their separate journeys, they would have to find their own path forward, whether together or apart. As night fell over the city, David thought about the strange twist of fate that had turned a simple divorce hearing into something that had changed so many lives. The truth had indeed shocked everyone, but perhaps the biggest shock had been learning that even in the darkest of situations, there was always a chance for redemption. The story of the police officer and his wife had become more than just a scandal, it had become a testament to the complexity of human nature, the power of truth, and the long, difficult road to healing.